Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to another installment of the NTC podcast. This is Aaron Washington, your host. Colin joins me once again, our cap specialist for NTC. And this time around, we have special guest Yossi Gozlan. Yossi used to be with Hoops Hype, but now he has a plethora of content on YouTube and other platforms, Twitter. He's a fellow capologist, so he goes into details of the CBA and contracts on YouTube, on Twitter. He has his own website, capsheets.com. So if you guys are looking for anything like that, information on the cap and things like that, be sure to check out Yossi. So he definitely kind of fits into our camp and NTC, things we cover with what Colin covers. And guys, I feel like I am a shorter point guard on a court right now that's covered by two big guys in the paint. So I can just kind of like go out there and gamble. And I know that I have two guys that have my back in the paint right now, like Gobert and Wemby earlier today in the gold medal game. So I feel good right now. I feel like I'm protected. But Yossi, glad to have you on this podcast. I think we had a pod like way back, maybe last year. But love your content, and you really fit well with what we do at NTC as far as covering the cap and other details of that nature. So thanks so much for joining us, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
And I think that's the only time me and him are going to be compared to Gobert and Wemby. So
I figured I'd throw you guys a bone on that one and just give you the props where it's due. So we're back in our usual shadow here. The last few podcasts were from NBA Summer League. And Yossi had some experience at the Sports Business Classroom mock trade deadline and got that whole experience, which was awesome. But now we're back to our normal programming here. And for this podcast, we're going to cover two different extensions that occurred over the last couple of weeks here in the NBA offseason. The first of which is going to be the Lauri Markkanen extension and renegotiation. So this is the second one, I believe, that we saw this summer. We discussed the Jonathan Isaac renegotiation and extension on a prior podcast. So if you guys are interested, check that out. This Markkanen extension is really interesting. And Colin, you have a lot of great insights on this deal. You actually covered this in an article that you posted on our website the day before he was eligible for the extension, which is really cool. I will put the link to that article in our description here, wherever you guys are listening to this podcast. But this extension is really interesting because how closely it fell to the NBA trade deadline. So Lauri Markkanen smartly decided to wait until August 7th, where he was eligible on August 6th to sign this deal. The total is 5 years, $238 million, $220 million in new money. So his contract for next season, 24-25, increased from $18 million to a little bit over $42 million. And the Jazz used their cap space that they had, some of the cap space, to make that possible. So Lauri gets that increase in his salary for next season, and then they tack on 4 more years. And that's going to start 25-26 at somewhere in the neighborhood of $46 million for the first year of the extension, and then it rolls out from there. So it's interesting because this is the 13th contract per Bobby Marks to be renegotiated and extended. And this is the 5th since January 2023. So not many instances of this in the entire history of the NBA, or at least not in recent history. But it is happening a little bit more frequently because we've seen 5 in less than 2 years. So it is a little bit more frequent. And, Colin, I don't want to steal all your thunder on this, but you did mention in your article that the CBA now allows teams to have a little bit more power to keep their players in an extension with that 140% now, which is an extra little incentive there to get players up to closer to the salary that they're worth. So there's a higher chance of retaining players and you're avoiding free agency. So that definitely helps out in this scenario and also helps out in the Jarrett Allen extension, which we'll get to later. So definitely interesting here. So Lauri cannot be traded for 6 months. That puts him past the trade deadline for this year. So don't have to worry about that, that's pretty cool for him. He has the security. And then I'm sure the Jazz will revisit next season, depending on what happens this season with that whole deal. But Colin, I want to pass it over to you now. Like I said, you had a lot of great insights on this in your article. So just wanted to see what you have to say about this deal, what you wanted to discuss. And, overall, do you think it's a smart move on the Jazz's part to renegotiate and extend Markkanen for an extra 4 years in addition to the boost in his salary for next season?
Yeah, I definitely do. When I wrote about it, I pretty much weighed their options as far as, if obviously he was one of the key pieces in trade rumors this offseason. And, if he was going to be traded, I thought that it would happen before the renegotiation happened. Because essentially what would happen is if he got renegotiated on August 6th, that was the only day that essentially he could be renegotiated and extended and still be traded before the trade deadline this year. So if that happened, essentially what Lauri would be saying is, sure, let's sign this big extension, and then everyone can just talk about me being traded all season. And I just didn't believe that would happen. I think he wanted to wait the day. He would sit comfortably for a year. He'd have his contract. And then from there, I just think that, it's an expensive contract, but as far as contracts go in this league, these days, I think that it just makes sense. He's making his max deal, but I think it ends up dipping at one point. It's not max after he gets his max raise. So what happens is he gets his max this year, and then in 26, 27, it dips a little bit. So he doesn't get the max raise every single year. And what happens is at that point, they essentially only have their rookie scale contracts coming up. So they're going to have a ton of flexibility. And as the raises are only 8% off of his initial increase in salary from the 25-26 year. So as everyone just assumes that the salary cap is going to go up 10% every year, with that dip in salary, his salary is just going to go down and down and down every year. So it's that 30% max, and it's just going to dip down. It looks like it's going to be roughly around 26% by the end of it. And for a player of his ilk, I mean, I think that's somewhat of a valuable contract. And what I said before that this all happened is the only downside of signing him at this point, you can't trade him this year. You can always trade him in the offseason, next offseason, right? And then at that point, the only downside is, look, you're trying to go for Cooper Flag. It's a strong draft next year. And if you're trying to tank, he's going to help you get more wins. I mean, that's the only real downside. But after so many years of, trying to tank at some points at the end of the year, you can't do that every single year. And even so, you can't let him walk. And if you hadn't traded him at this point, you're not going to trade him for max value on a 1-year deal. And like you said, Aaron, if you trade him to another team, most likely it's not a team with cap space, so they can't renegotiate and extend him, right? So there's no real option where you can trade him away and then they have the ability of what you just did. So, which is the whole point of this 6-month bar from trading, right? So it makes a lot of sense that you do this now, you let it play out, you assess your young players, you see where your talent's at, and then in the 2025 offseason, you kind of see where you're at. If it's worth trading him at that point, fine. If he's worth sticking around, then great. You move forward at that point.
Yeah, Colin, those were great points about the deal. I fully agree. I think that it's a good move on the Jazz's part to just go ahead and lock him up for all those reasons you mentioned. And he's definitely worth that deal. So, Yossi, I wanted to get your thoughts as well. You've covered this deal in depth and you've posted some details on Twitter. What were your thoughts of the deal? Are you kind of in line with Colin? And, how do you feel about all this?
So the first thing that I think you got to look at is what was he going to get offered next summer? And I think it was pretty clear that he was probably going to get max level offers. He could have gotten 4 for 200 from another team, and that's basically what he's getting on those last 4 years, I believe. So for Utah, I was like, they were definitely shopping him around. There was rumors, they were reporting that they were doing that, and they were probably looking for some crazy offer that they did not get. And I think they got in that process, I'm sure they got several pieces of intel. One, what teams are willing to pay for him, which is max level money, and two, that he probably would still have good trade value on this contract. So they went ahead and gave him the most he was able to get was 5 years, $250 million. He gets 5 for $238, so he gets about $12 million less than the max. And the biggest difference is, he's getting the max the first 2 years, and there's no player option. There are no incentives, no bonuses, so there's not really much room for him to make even more money if he were to get traded. Anyway, yeah, he didn't get the trade bonus. And so the biggest thing for Utah is one, they didn't get there's no player option, which is probably good on their end. And then the last 3 years, they're below max level money. Not too much below max, roughly like 3 million a year below each of those seasons' respective maxes. So that's where I think Utah is like what they kind of get out of this. Where right now, I don't know if his trade value I don't know if it's easier to trade him now that he's going to be at the max this year, next year. But if he's still on Utah in 3 years, 3 and 4 and 5, that's when I think it gets a little relatively cheaper when as the cap goes up, and that's when so it might be a little. He might have even more trade value then. He's got more years on his deal, and it's still sub max. I think it was a good deal for him. He got pretty close to the maximum amount he was able to get, and that's the main thing to take away for the Jazz is maybe some people got some sticker shock seeing that number, but it's still, but I still think there's some benefits. It's still a good deal for their end. Now, and clearly, yeah, he didn't want to be traded, so he never had to agree to anything on August 6th. That's why they waited a day. Nothing the Jazz could have done about that. But yeah, we'll see what happens. Sounds like the Jazz will again play this game where they're going to overachieve at some point, and then they gotta shut things down, and hopefully they get a better than like the 10th overall pick of this year, and then we'll see what happens as far as Lauri's fate, because now that he's locked up, it's up to Utah whatever they want to do with him.
Yeah, exactly. That you bring up that point about him and how they deal with him at the end of seasons. I think that's going to come up again. It's if he has a minor ankle sprain, I mean they're going to just use whatever means they can to have him sit out some games, play a little bit less. I would expect that to happen again. I think last season that was definitely the case for him. So, I mean, that's going to be the reality as long as they're in this situation. But of course, like with a guy like this, and I think Colin, you touched on this, he presents a certain floor to your team. When you have somebody that's of the caliber of Markkanen that's worth nearly the max, Yossi, as you just mentioned, there's a level of play that's going to be sustained if he's on the court. So while you have him there, I mean, you're going to be at a certain level. And of course, with the whole renewed lottery rules, I'm sure that even if you're the 5th or 6th worst team in the league, you still have a shot at number 1. We've seen it happen before. So it's not a death sentence necessarily. They can still be in that range for a top pick in this great draft. So I expect that to happen again. But I'm with both of you guys. I think that they were smart to do this deal. And of course, it was also smart for Markkanen. And Colin, I think I texted you this a few days ago. The nature of this deal was really interesting to me because he had so much leverage here. He had so much power over whether he's traded or not. We rarely see that. You really see a player that, hey, if you wait a day or two, you can literally like prevent yourself from being traded for an entire season without an implicit no trade clause. That's pretty interesting there. So that part for me stood out. He definitely took advantage of that in the best way he could. And I mean, he gets the money he's worth. And the Jazz save a few bucks. I mean, Yossi, you're talking about $3 million a season. I mean, it doesn't seem like a lot, but you add that into an increasing cap. And Colin, I think you said it was going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of like 26% once we get to the back end of it. If you combine those factors together, I mean, the value proposition only gets better for Utah. And then, of course, there's going to be a time in the future where I'm sure that they re-engage with teams about trading him. I think this season in particular is going to be a big determining factor here. Their finish here, how Markkanen performs is going to determine whether or not they want to pursue that again. But I mean, whether or not they do, I mean, they're under no pressure to do it. And it's always great to extend these players because you're keeping them around. They're not a flight risk. And then it's just salary on the books that at another point in time you can look at trading. It's just good to have that. As long as you're not drastically overpaying a player, it's good to have it on your books, and then you kind of don't have to worry about that player for the foreseeable future in terms of a contract. So that only helps this case, especially when the cap is going to do what it's going to do. So I'm on board with it. I think it looks good.
And everyone likes to talk about NBA trades all the time, which it makes sense. And I think there's no doubt that he was involved in trade talks this offseason. But when it comes down to it, what Utah paid for a top end talent, it doesn't even limit their flexibility as they move forward. We'll talk about Jarrett Allen. I think that limits Cleveland's flexibility. Here, they sign Lauri, and next year I think they still have like up to just over 50% of the cap in obligations, and before you talk about the rookie scale contracts, the options that they end up picking up. And then in 26, 27, he's the only contract other than the rookie scale options that you pick up, right? So it's not even taking them away from any max contract that they would bring in, whether it's free agency or trade. They, of course, have a ton of first-round picks. I think they have 4 first-round picks in 2027. So they're prime, even if they keep Lauri on the books, even if he sticks around as a key piece, even if he ends up becoming the third option on their team, it's not going to hurt them, I don't think, in bringing in other players via the draft, free agency, or trade, because they can use him in the trade. They can use these other pieces, these young players that they already have on the team as a trade, or all these picks, and they can bring in the key player via cap space still, you would think. So, obviously they still have to fill in those roster spots as they move forward, but they still have a ton of flexibility. Signing Lauri doesn't limit them in any way. The only thing it does is it retains a good player, and it adds another trade chip if they wanted it down the road. But I think he's a good player for them that could be a key piece as they keep building as well.
That's a great point. For the majority of this contract, there's really little other salary obligation for the Jazz. So it was I'm sure it wasn't that difficult of a decision to decide to give him all this money, especially they front loaded it in the first 2 years. Because I believe after next year, Collins and Clarkson are expiring.
Right.
They'll be off the book. So yeah, it's just going to be him and all these rookie player guys. So that could be a window to that'll have been 4 years of this rebuild that might be a perfect time to start to compete.
Right. And I think like if you're talking about a different time where, those rookies are coming up on max extensions, and you're talking about him and, 2 other guys that are now on 25% max deals, now you're really thinking about, okay, is he a key cog in this, or are we going to have to sign this and then absolutely have to unload him to keep all these guys? But they don't even have to decide on that right now. I think they have a lot of leeway and flexibility moving forward, even with this deal.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at the top end of the roster. I mean, their highest paid players are, you look at Jordan Clarkson and John Collins. I mean, those are other guys. If they decide to dive further into this youth movement, they can always shop those players. John Collins at 26.5. I think in years past, it might have been looked at as negative value contract, but I mean, he still offers a lot for a team that's set up in a certain way. I don't think you can just trade him to anybody and him be successful, but if they find the right trade partner, he's always an option. And then they can just kind of lean into that young core. And even with their young core, their extension talks are years away. I mean, you're looking at first round picks from last year. You have 3 years or so before, they're embarking on their second contract if they stick around. So yeah, I mean, you guys are definitely on point with that. There's definitely a window here, and it's really, you have to look at the cost and benefit analysis here. There's a lot more benefits to re-signing him apart from the cost. There are a few, but it's nowhere near what you gain from keeping him around. So just to quickly touch on like what he brings to the team from an encore perspective, we'd lightly touched on why this team is going to be not necessarily at the bottom, we're thinking, because of what he provides to the team and why he's worth all this money. When you look at a guy like him, yes, he's not a Kevin Durant, he's not a LeBron James. You're not just going to give him the ball and say, go to work. But, I mean, the advanced stats love him. And if you go look at certain play types for him, if you look at handoffs, if you look at, pick and pops and things like that, I mean, he's an elite player. There aren't many other players in the NBA at his size that can shoot the way he does. So when you look at somebody that can set great screens, he can roll pretty well also. He's a multi-functioning big man that can be your second or third option. Then you're going to have so much you could work with. These guards are coming up like Keontae George. and other guys like that, as the Okoye, like if they get to a certain point to where they're solid floor generals, it unlocks their game as well. So everybody benefits by having Lauri Markkanen on the court that can shoot like he does, and he's pretty good in the paint, which I think that was one of his weaknesses coming into the NBA. But in years 7 and 8 and beyond, I mean, he's gotten so savvy, and he knows how to use his body down low as well. So he's just a really good connective piece. You throw him on any team, and he's instantly going to make you better just because of how efficient he is. Even on a team like Utah, where it's like you don't have a lot of weapons, he still finds a way to be impactful and successful. So that's why the Jazz feel like, let's give him all this money. To the untrained eye, it doesn't really seem like a good idea here, but we know his game, and we know he's worth that. So I almost feel like he's kind of underrated because of what he brings to the table for a team like Utah, and really any team that you'd be a part of.
No, I think that's a great point. And honestly, I think that is something that isn't spoken of a lot. Is everyone just wants to rebuild and unload older players because you're not good. And I think what he can do is what you said, is unlock a lot of different things for Will Hardy and the team and help out these younger players. I mean, he brings so much flexibility on the offensive side of the ball for what he can do as that stretch big, right? So when you bring him into the fold for these young guys, I think that he can help out a lot. And if you take him off the floor, just imagine how much pressure that puts on these young guys, right? And then you're stuck with Jordan Clarkson carrying the load, really, other than the young players. And so I think just even having him on the floor, just to take the pressure off those guys on top of everything else that we talked about, I think is a huge value to the team.
Absolutely. Well, I think that about does it on this deal. I think we're all in agreement. It was good for the Jazz to do this, and we're have to keep an eye on him because I don't think it's going to be over as far as the saga of Markkanen being on the trade block. I'm sure at some point in the future will come up again, but for now, he's locked in, and the Jazz feel good about it. So moving on to our second extension of this podcast, we're looking at Jarrett Allen now. With the Cavaliers, he's a player that, I mean, I think he's just one of the most solid centers that you can find in the NBA. Again, not a player that he's not a go-to player, but as far as what he offers in his energy and rim protection, he's just so solid. So for this deal, Allen still had a couple of years left on his deal, unlike Markkanen, but it's going to be a 3-year, $91 million extension. So that amounts to about $131 million over the next 5 years for Jarrett Allen. The extension starts in 26-27, so there's still a couple of years left before that kicks in. That puts him at about $28 million, which is a good increase over his $20 million that he's earning right now. And again, that increase in what you can offer a player in an extension in this new CBA is such a help for a team like the Cavaliers, because otherwise you might have just elected to wait until he hit free agency and then maybe try to get an extension or get a new contract that way. But they lock him back in. So he joins Mobley and getting an extension this summer. He also joins Donovan Mitchell, so he's on a long-term contract, and Garland is already on a new contract. So all those guys are locked in for several years. Your core is set. They've really doubled down on this because they didn't accept trade offers that were coming in. Teams were interested in Allen. They were interested in Donovan Mitchell, and they're staying the course here with this extension here for Allen. So I think, again, this is a good deal to make. He's well under the max when the new extension kicks in 2 years with increased money coming into the NBA. He's still a sub $30 million a year player. So with a guy like Allen, who is going to be a great rebounder for you, and he's going to be a great piece for a winning team because he defends the rim, and any team that's going to be in any kind of contention has to have a player like that can defend the rim reasonably well. And he's a great screener. He's a great teammate. So I like the value proposition here. And it's just going to get better. And again, no options on this one. It's pretty straightforward, just another 3 years onto his deal. So I think for the Cavaliers here, they're doubling down. I think there's more questions about the on-court perspective of this deal. Is he going to fit with Mobley? Are they going to be able to make a winning core out of this long-term? But just from a monetary perspective, I think it makes sense. You have no worries about him leaving, and you're getting great value on him. He was already a great value at $20 million, but at 28, I think it's going to be even stronger with the way this cap is moving. And I don't have the percentages on me, but I mean, he's probably in the low 20s when it comes to the percentage of the cap he's taking up. So really solid stuff, I think, for both sides of this extension. Yossi, what are you thinking about this extension here? It's not the same caliber as Markkanen. The situation is different. This is a winning franchise. There's more pressure on everybody to win now. But I think there's some common themes here when it comes to the extension part of it and just adding more good money onto an already good contract.
So this one I'm not as high on, and I'm less certain on how I feel about it right now. I was pretty surprised that this extension ended up getting done, just because how rare it is for how less common it is for extensions to get done when there's more than a year left on a deal, and this is just like a new market breaking type of number because generally the market is pretty harsh on centers. Like the past 4 to 5 years, the tier of center that Jared Allen is, they're making around what he's making, 20 million. Guys like him and Nikola Vucevic, Jakob Poeltl, he's better than those guys, but this is kind of like what this sub all-star, but like above average starting center type of center has been making. And this is so for the Cavs, it's probably a big calculation that they think that one, he's gonna keep playing at a high level, but also that this whatever $30 million a year salary will actually be team friendly, and that they're thinking that with the cap going up, that players like him will make even more money. So if that's the bet, I get why they did it, but I also think that just with centers, we don't know exactly how it's going to shake out until it happens. And the only other center that's starting to get starting to like break above that range, it's not a max center. You just saw with Nick Claxton, he's going to get 25 mil a year. So I think so. That's the only way that I don't think it's going to be like a terrible deal, but for it to be like a bargain for the Cavs, they're basically betting on the center market just breaking above the $30 million range for these sub-max level guys. I think for Jared Allen, this is I like this a lot better for Jared Allen. So that's why I was surprised that he took it. I just didn't think the Cavs would just commit that. So with all the factors I said about centers, if you can get that level of money, I mean, Isaiah Hardenstein, I forgot, he's the other guy, got 30 mil a year, but short-term deal. So that's the other market breaker.
And declining too. That one's declining as well. So
yeah, and I'm sure that they'll probably decline that team option and get him at something a little cheaper. So that makes a lot of sense for the Thunder. So just given just how rough the market could be for centers, even with the cap expected to go up all these years, I think it's a good move for him to take this money now while it was offered. So now the other good thing for the Cavs is they could potentially still trade him this season, but it seems like they're just gonna run it back, run everything back as much as they can. Their Ross, they'll probably just see how things go under. I forgot the coach's name already, Atkinson, and just I kind of don't anticipate them trading him at all, anybody right now. See what happens at the deadline. So does this help his trade value? I don't know. You're adding more years, but I think he was already in a pretty good spot. So and then now it's only an additional 3 years instead of potentially having to extend him beyond that next year. So I guess that's the other better thing. Maybe it helps his trade value a little bit. We'll see though. I think it was good though for him mostly. I like it a lot better for him.
Yeah, I agree. It especially as far as the timing is concerned because they maxed out his extension. So it's like if you were going to rush to get the deal done, if you're only going to be able to max him out, why did you have to hurry to do that? Unless you like really think he's going to just is he threatening free agency already? So you want to lock him in, or is it really let's lock him in now because now we have the flexibility of trading him on a long-term deal, and that might be what it is. And just to jump in as far as the percentages don't make it seem as bad as the overall deal. And I do agree, Yossi, as far as the market is concerned, you're absolutely right. When you talk about Nick Claxton at 25, Hartenstein, I think he's getting, 27 or 28 this year, and then it goes down, and then there's a team option. So, this is by far better than those deals. But he's going to get around 16 and a half. Again, this is assuming 10% increases. In the first year of the extension, it's 16.5%. It goes down to almost 16% and then 15%. So it's not crazy percentages, but again, it's for a center. You sign him earlier. My biggest gripe about all of this, I think more, is that you signed all of these guys, and I think what everyone can kind of say or think, at least right now, is that does Garland, Mitchell, Allen, Mobley get it done? Do we think that core can get it done? And that's the major question, because when we're talking about in 26 and 27, them and with Strus, you're over 126% or 106% of the cap, and that's with the increases. So you're over, you're locked in with those guys unless you make a move. So, and that's the thing. So are you committed to these guys, or are you locking them in and you're just like most of the teams now? Let's sign them now, figure it out later. And that might be what they're doing. Let's figure it out with Atkinson this year. Everyone's locked in long term. If we can't figure it out with these guys, they're not negative salary. It's not a negative asset, so we can unload any of these guys. We just have to figure out which one we want to unload. So that might be what it is, but I think you're right. It's an interesting contract at this point. At first, it was a little bit of a sticker shock when I look at the percentages now, because it's in 26, 27 when it starts. It doesn't seem as bad as it initially did. But again, I don't understand jumping in so early to max someone out. Other than if you want that asset to trade, knowing that you have them locked up long term now. I think that might be what it is. In comparison to when you think of Lauri, right? So Lauri, you had him on a 1-year deal. No one wanted to trade for him, right? Because then they had to deal with the extension. You have Allen earlier on, obviously not as good of a player, but now you know that you have him more long term. That might be what they're looking at.
Yeah, Colin, two things that you brought up that I think are really important. The first is that trade component. So, and I think, Yossi, you said it could possibly be to, one of the good things about this deal. It could bring up his trade value a little bit. So if the Cavs believe that in their minds, like, hey, it's only going to help his trade value, then at the deadline or next summer, if things don't shake quite right, it gives us an even better chance of moving him later on. So I think they could be looking at that. I think that's what I was thinking when this deal was made. I was surprised, like you guys were initially, because, hey, he's not even close to becoming a free agent. So it almost looked like they jumped the gun on this one. But, if you just really want to max out what he's got left, so another team is maybe more inclined to take him on, I get that. And then the other part of it is his value, and not value today, but the value in 2 years when the extension kicks in. So that's what I was looking at. I wasn't looking at the $28 million in a vacuum today. I was looking at the $28 million in the year that it becomes, that he earns it. So in 2 years, when the cap is higher and it's going to take up less of the cap, that's why I was thinking, like, okay, it's really not that bad of a contract, because Hartenstein is making similar money today, but it's not the same as making that money in 2 years. So when you look at it from that perspective, okay, it makes a little bit more sense, and it can be more value there. And something else I thought about, and I think Bobby Marks mentioned this, like he had a video with, I think, another podcast recently, and they brought up player value, and they were talking about how it's not a fixed thing. So it's like you look at two centers and it's like, oh, this guy made 20 million, this guy made 20 million, and it's an apples to apples thing. I think a lot of it is team situation can really dictate player value, not necessarily what other centers are making. So with the Cavaliers, they put a lot of importance on what he does for this team alongside a player like Garland and also Mitchell. It kind of brings back that joke I made earlier about me being a smaller point guard and you guys have my back, so I know that I don't have as much to worry about guarding on the perimeter. He serves that role for the Cavaliers because Garland and Mitchell are not great defenders. So he is a crucial piece to that team. And if they want to get anywhere in the playoffs, they're going to need him. And for what they need, he plays that role very well. So I think for the Cavaliers specifically, that can boost his value more than, let's say, if he was on the open market for another team that didn't need him as badly. Maybe they have better guards up front. So I think that's just another component to consider. It's not a direct comparison with other centers. It also depends on what role they play for their team and how much those teams are willing to pay in order for them to serve that role in that situation. So there's something else I thought about that I've been seeing online recently. But
I agree with that, and I think it's that, but you also have to compare it to, well, if we don't come to an agreement, what does he think he's going to get out in the free agency market? Because then you're over the non-taxpayer, so now you're dealing in cap space world. So who are you going to sign with that's going to pay you that $28 million, that wants a defensive-minded center? And then you look at Hartenstein, he got paid, so maybe he finds someone like that. He lands somewhere like that. So you have to weigh that. There's a lot of different factors that come in. I think the main thing now in the new era of the CBA and the NBA is, let's extend these guys out as long as they're not negative value, as long as they're not a Zach LaVine, and we can trade them down the line and get something back and clear out that cap space, but keep the salary slot, then let's just extend it and figure it out later. And I think that's kind of the goal. And the timing might be a little weird, but in the end, if it doesn't work out, they'll trade him. I mean, that's just what it's going to come down to, right? I mean, and I don't think that in 2 years it's going to be such a bad contract that someone wouldn't take it on for some type of asset where you're not giving up a pick like it sounds like they have to do in Chicago, right? I mean, that is the nightmare scenario, is you have such a bad situation where you can't unload the contract because it's so bad. And that's your own goal. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think like I said, the biggest bet the Cavs are making is that with the way Jarrett Allen's playing, that the market for a guy at his level is going to be $30 million a year, and there's probably a pretty decent chance that happens. I can't predict the market, but I guess the other thing is, again, because of the nature of how the market has been for centers, maybe it's just the rush aspect that I'm a little still hung up on, where like Jarrett Allen, not a guy with like a big history of injuries or anything like that. He's been a pretty durable 8-year veteran. So now he's locked up through his 13th year. The risk when you're extending a player this early on, 2 years before his contract's up, is will this player hold up then? So I think that's even more so, I guess, the biggest thing they're betting on than the financial aspect. Because if he continues playing at this level, okay, he's probably going to be a $30 million center once the contract extension kicks in. So that's the big bet. Like, I don't see any reason why he shouldn't. I don't see why he should drop off. But that's the biggest risk, is like, will he keep this level of play for 5 more years? So they seem pretty confident in that.
Yeah, Yossi, and I think they're also confident that he can figure out how to coexist with Mobley on the front line. I think that's another bet they're making. So not only Allen's play individually, but his play in that team system. So those guys traditionally, especially last season, I think it was even more apparent. When they were on the court together, you had that traditional 5-man rotation. So you had Garland and Mitchell up top, and then you had Mobley and Allen down low, and you had Okoro on the court, or Strus. Traditionally, they didn't perform very well by the numbers. Their net ratings together weren't great. But once you had one or the other on the court, it spiked. So if you had Allen without Mobley or Mobley without Allen, things would get a lot better. So, I mean, that's a lot of evidence pointing to, like, hey, these guys don't work well together. But if you bring in Atkinson, they're saying, okay, maybe he can figure this out. Him along with individual growth from Mobley. We expect him to make another jump. And that's why they invested in him. He got a max rookie extension earlier on. So with those two players now having all these years, they're coinciding together. They're betting on him to figure it out. Me personally, I'm not super confident in that, but Mobley's so young that, I mean, there's still time for him to turn it around and be a better shooter and to work better with Mobley. So it could happen, but that along with the issue of having Garland and Mitchell in the backcourt as a defensive mess, kind of, it brings a little bit of skepticism to my mind, just from an encore perspective. So I think that's just something else to think about as far as, can this work out? It can, but it hasn't been pretty so far. So hopefully next season that turns around. All right, guys. So I think that's a pretty good summary of both of these deals. There is some good, there's some bad to both, but they're both, I think, just great signs of what is happening in this new CBA, this new environment of the NBA. Colin, like you mentioned before, this is going to continue. We're going to see more extensions and maybe even more renegotiations as we get down the line of teams just trying to navigate this new environment with the new apron rules and all these other things that have come up from this new collective bargaining agreement. But guys, I think that's a good time to close it out. I want to thank you both for joining. Colin, always good to have you on. Yossi, thanks for joining us. Again, really respect your work and what you're doing on the CBA side of things. So keep it up. And hopefully we could do this again in the near future, man. Appreciate the time.
I appreciate all that, and thanks for having me on again, guys. Yeah, I'd love to be back.
Good seeing you, Yossi.
Awesome, man. So yeah, for NTC, we're going to keep covering all these deals and more that might arise as we get closer to the NBA season. So be sure to check us out at notradeclause.com. We're going to have all these resources we touched on in this podcast, the cap sheets, cap sheet percentage, Colin's article about the deal and other trades that have happened this summer. His CBA change tracker is a great resource, so check that out. And then, of course, Yossi's resources as well over on his Twitter and other platforms. So we'll do our best to cover it as best as we can for you guys. So thanks so much for joining us on this episode, and we hope to see you on the next installment of NTC. Take care.